All right, everyone, it looks like it is 9 a.m.
Yep.
Welcome back. Good to see you. And just to clarify, of course, you know that for the third week in January, I came down with a cold, so I had to delay. And then last week, about Tuesday, I sort of got a cold, another cold. And I've been, struggling along with that, really up until, yesterday was kind of rocky still. So I'm just not getting too close, and I will take the mask off to speak up here, but just kind of do try to keep your distance and keep healthy. And there are extra copies of the handouts from the first two sessions in January. If you need one, if you want one, there's some available. I also have copies of today's, but I always kind of preface it like, well, I'll hand them out, but please don't cheat and look at the end and see, right? So let me do that now. And so, actually, Brian, do you want to sort of take and offer those? All right. So, well, I offer a beautiful, inspiring image of the martyrdom of Bible translator John Rogers in 1555, being burned at the stake for his work. Bible. So, so let's have a quick review. The Bible in English so far. You may remember that the first one was John Wycliffe translating the New Testament only into English, and basically Middle English at this point, right, in 1300s. So that was a pretty controversial thing, and I think it got him executed for his trouble. The second Bible in English was William Tyndale, 1526 and 1534 for the whole Bible. He started with the New Testament only. And you compare those dates, it's right in the time frame that Martin Luther in Germany is translating the whole Bible into German. And so very much kind of aligned spiritually, you might say, in that, that Protestant mindset of the time. Bible number 3 was produced by Miles Coverdale, 1535 and 1537 printings. Number 4 was John Rogers, creating what was called the Matthew Bible. Number 5, the so-called Great Bible of 1539, which was a sort of a presentation Bible, a fancy Bible, produced by Coverdale, who we saw above, produced by Coverdale for official use in the Church of England. English Bible number 6 was the so-called Geneva Bible. 1557 was the New Testament, and then the whole Bible came out in 1560. And it was really a great production. And in fact, I have a facsimile of that I can, sort of pass around if you'd like to sort of thumb through. Have a look. It's really neat because it's got not only, the biblical text, but all kinds of annotations and background information about, the Holy Land and history and just all kinds of neat things that make it, a really fascinating object of study. And so, in fact, it was so popular, check out the statistic, we talked about it before, that 120 editions of the Geneva Bible came out by 1664. So just over 100 years, there's 120 editions. So that's, kind of the Stephen King of, 16th century publishing, right? And importantly, remember the thing about the Bible with the chapter and the verse numbers. Remember, those verse numbers Those never, ever, ever existed in the Bible until the 1550s. There was a French printer who did a printing of the Bible where he had this idea like, oh, stick those in to just kind of keep track of stuff. Oh my gosh. I mean, that was such a great idea. I mean, there was no such thing as, like copyright or whatever at the time. But almost immediately from then on, those Bible verses are in. And, you hear these funny statistics about numbers of verses and like, well, what's the longest verse in the Bible? And it'll be kind of long. But, it's like, that's not really that interesting biblically speaking, because really it's just sort of what a printer in France did in the 1550s. That's what it is, so, right?
David,
Yeah.
did everyone just follow that French person's interpretation?
That is my understanding, yes. That basically when that was done in the Geneva Bible, that from then on, forget about it. Because it's so cool. I mean, it's so helpful, like to refer to someone to pinpoint something in the Bible.
But that was his judgment, where to separate.
Yeah.
And it was still accepted.
That's all I've ever heard about. Is just he just had this idea of making it more, more accessible, more logical to work through, what have you. So yeah, pretty neat, right? The Bishop's Bible of 1568 was used in Anglican churches. The Geneva Bible was the popular one, but the church, they weren't sure about all those annotations and all that extra information in the Geneva Bible. Lots of stuff to get distracted by with that, right? And then remember that English Bible number 8 was named after 2 cities in France, Douai, Reims. It was the Bible translated into English by and for the Catholic Church. So finally, the Catholics do have the Bible in English also. So that's a quick review. And that brings us to English Bible number 9, the King James. It's, I think the way we think about the Bible, if we think about it that much, we probably think of like, wow, the King James Bible, that must have been like the first, but it wasn't. There were lots of English Bibles and Bible traditions that the King James actually inherits and builds on. So, do we need yet another English Bible? Sort of a king of Bibles, if you will. And, King James seemed to think so. Remember the situation, the boring Bishop's Bible was the official one in the Church of England. The Geneva Bible was people's favorite, but politically, and like all those annotations and all that stuff, not so sure about that. So basically, the king undertook a Bible that would be the authorized version, and typically abbreviated KJV, King James Version. So you'll see that abbreviation a lot. And we'll talk a lot about the first one in 1611. Of course, it was printed and reprinted many times. And the master text that was actually quite important for the 1800s, 1900s for our Bible is an extensive revision of the King James Version by Benjamin Blaney in Oxford in 1769. So even the King James, is a thing that has evolved and had a history all its own. So, as we go through all of these, no two Bibles are probably quite the same among all of these that are being produced. But the King James was special as far as kind of a learned and scholarly and careful undertaking. Now, King James ruled from 1603 to 1625, wanted an authorized alternative, again, to the popular but politically questionable Geneva Bible. He envisioned revising the official bishop's Bible, but in doing that, really wanted to undertake to reevaluate ancient and more recent texts. In other words, the original Hebrew, Greek, and Latin would be examined as much as those were available and able to be evaluated. And then other English as well as German and French translations that were around by this time. And it's important to think that this is really a revision, not a whole new translation. Okay. So there was a set of rules to guide this authorized version. There were to be panels of expert linguists and scholars as translators. The preference was to use the bishop's Bible wording when it was accurate. Secondarily, other English versions if they were available. So in other words, it wasn't a whole new translation from the ground up. It was sort of looking at what was out there and kind of bringing it together the best they could, but with a lot of scholars who were very smart, doing that work. Not really much in the way of explanatory marginal notes, so very unlike the Geneva Bible in that way, but of course used Robert Estienne's chapters and verses created in Geneva in 1551, like we were just talking about. We had to have those verse numbers, and it did include this set of texts, the Apocrypha, that sort of come and go among different versions of the Bible, really from the 5th and 6th century to today. Most of the versions of Bibles and King James keep these until the 19th century anyway. So King James Version, the work and the text. The Bible was sort of broken up between 6 companies of men, 2 at Westminster, 2 at Cambridge, 2 at Oxford. And then among those people doing that work, so kind of, I guess, like kind of committees. So you take chapter 1, you take chapter 2, and then trade papers and check each other's work. It would be things like that, right? Then selected team members gathered for 9 months in London in 1610. And so then, they produced the King James Version. And of course, an obvious question, we read the King James Version. Well, actually, when we read the King James Version, we are probably already reading a version that is pretty updated and edited heavily from what came out in 1610. But we have this idea, or it has been suggested, that the King James Version was, definitive in the history of the English language and reflects the language of the time and stuff like that. However, the scholarly consensus overall is that did the new version reflect the people's language in England of 1600? Somewhat, yes, but the feeling is that the King James Version is itself pretty stilted even to the ears of people in 1600. Right? Pretty formal, often already archaic, kind of in keeping with those earlier English Bibles that, of course, they're old, so they would be archaic in that sense. Things like, using singular thou versus plural you, that felt pretty antiquated even then. Also, this don't think of very much, but in Middle English, there's a use of his for its. Just, we now distinguish his versus its as very distinct things, but it was one form in English at that time. The verb ending ev versus s, he speaks, he speaketh. That s ending really is prevalent by 1600 or so. So, did King James have a huge impact on the development of English? you know, it's debatable. We'll just leave it at that. So more about the King James First Edition from 1611. It was printed by Robert Barker, the King's printer. Later, Cambridge and Oxford were always also allowed to get in on the action. This was a large folio book, about 11 inches by 16 inches. There were about 70 pages of preliminary materials in there. And I can go ahead and pass around if you want to just kind of thumb through and look a little. This here is a 400th anniversary edition of the 1611 text of King James. But mercifully, it's in like modern typeface, like we're used to, not the old, kind of Germanic looking stuff, like what you see there. So I can just pass this around and you can have a look, and this basically is that exact text. So
Wonder how much it was.
this one's not too bad. Here, I'll bet the printed ones were probably pretty. Yeah. So.
So David, are you going to explain further what apocrypha means, and did you already, and I just wasn't in the room?
No, I didn't say much, and I have to say, I don't know much about it. I think it's kind of, my sense is it's sort of a set of books that are sort of biblical in tone, style, dating, tradition, but have had kind of a uneasy level of authority granted or understood by leaders of the church through the centuries. So I know that the thing that this is the best I can do on that. I remember Martin Luther's German Bible where he keeps them. He has the Apocrypha. And the way he describes them is that they're not so holy as the other scripture, but they're good to read. So Joel, can you
speak to that?
add to that? Yeah.
Before the Reformation, in Western Christianity, and I'm sure true in Eastern Christianity too, there was no set canonical list of these are the books. I don't think that should leave us to go, oh, that means they can read the Gospel of Mary. It's not that. It's that authority in the church was not understood to be this list of books. Authority in the church rested in the authorities, your bishops and your popes. But that was called into question at the Reformation, when Protestants came along and said, we don't need this pope anymore. Okay, then where are you going to get your authority? Well, they started to look to the Bible. Okay, then you have to ask, what's included in the Bible? These types of questions simply weren't on the minds of people who weren't literate and didn't have Bibles in their hands. So it wasn't a crisis, it wasn't an issue, it wasn't a controversy until Protestants needed a source of authority, and then they started saying, these books, not those ones. So exactly as David said, Luther looked at the Apocrypha, and what is the Apocrypha? It's primarily the books between the end of Malachi and the New Testament. And that's a good chunk of time, what we call the intertestamental period. Things like the Maccabean Jewish Revolt in 200 BC. We just have nothing in our Protestant Bibles about that because we, for whatever reason, decided to exclude those books from our canon. Luther didn't say they're bad books, they're good books, but they aren't scripture.
Right.
The Roman Catholics, sensing an opportunity, said, now we're going to include the Apocrypha in our Bible. What does that allow you to do? If you're a good Roman Catholic trying to say, you can now look at your Protestant friends and say, you guys don't even have all the books of the Bible. You claim to be Bible people. It's all a power game between competing sects of Christianity vying for who's in authority now, if not the Bible.
Right. And it's about 1,000-year tradition that we're talking about.
It's a good chunk of time, and
So,
a lot of our new Bibles, including on Sundays now, I'm reading from the NRSV UE, New Revised Standard Edition, Updated Edition. It just got updated last year. It includes the Apocrypha. So, to be totally honest with you, I've not even read the whole Apocrypha. I should. It's embarrassing that I haven't. But these are not bad books, and they're distinguished from what we also call the pseudepigrapha, which are the books that basically nobody thinks are genuine, but that doesn't mean they are valueless. And that would include things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter. Nobody thought these are real books. That doesn't mean they are valueless, but so that's their view. I'm done.
Very good. Thank you.
And I just wanted to mention, because my daughter ended up one of the bars in high school, so of course they had religious rights, and she did have to buy a Catholic Bible,
Okay.
so we had to have a separate Bible.
Okay. Yeah.
And now that I've interrupted you, put you out of your flow, one more question.
Sure.
You mentioned the annotations being missing or not, or controversial or in or out. Even in these include like the annotations of, we're not sure about this, it could be here, it could be this, it could be that, some, you know, how we have so many footnotes like that.
Right,
Is that what they're referring to, or more stuff that's on the side that says, isn't it wonderful that Mary is such a great virgin, or whatever?
Right, I think it's more explanatory, not the things like cross-references, you know, like,
Yeah,
you know, in the
Cross-references is a good one.
margins, so yeah.
so they kept the cross margins, or they developed that at some point?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Actually, if you're wondering what the situation is in the 1611 text, that's the book that's going around. That, yeah, so what you see, no, not Geneva, the
big one.
the big one, yes, where did the big one get? Oh, Martin's holding it up.
Yeah.
Okay, well.
No.
All right. So, and let's see, well, so we have this scholarly opinion, and the King James Version, you know, I mean, anything that huge, it's not going to be absolutely 100% perfect, but the quality comfortably exceeded that of any other book published in the 17th century. So that's not bad, right? I mean, that's also the century of, you know, Shakespeare and stuff. And it's funny, there were the first two printings of the 1611 edition, you know, in that year basically, and they call them the he and she Bibles, which is a funny thing, but it just happens to be from a text where it's Ruth chapter 3, verse 15, and so check this out. Let's see, and when she held it, he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her, and he went into the city. Versus, when she held it, he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her, and she went into the city. And so, and it's kind of funny because in this, I have this English Standard Version and Luther translation. So I thought, well, and it turns out the English here says she went into the city. But Luther, und ging in die Stadt. He. So Joel, in this crucial text of the Bible, do you know, is it the lady with the barley?
You go to the Greek or the Hebrew.
You know, so anyway, but it was kind of an easy mark, right, of like, you know, one addition to the next. Because remember, every one of these printings requires big groups of low-paid, high-skilled men to take letters upside down and backwards, stuff them on there, 1 page at a time, then tear it apart, do it all over for the next page. And, I mean, so when you consider the work that had to be done, it's pretty spectacular that something like this is kind of, you know, the level of error that you have. John?
Just think of the thousands of hours that it took to make those letters that they're using to put for 1 page.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, think about how there's been a number of these Bibles where we say something like, well, the New Testament came out in, you know, like, 1550 or something, and then the whole Bible is like 3 years later. Well, because the New Testament for Christians, that's a really good part. You want the New Testament. You gotta get the Old Testament too. But it's like, you know, like twice as long or whatever. So, I mean, if you're opportunistic in your publishing, which most publishers are if they want to keep publishing, you get that New Testament out, and well, then you got to do it all. So, all right. And this, just to give a sense of what we're talking about, like all these names, Wycliffe, Coverdale, Matthew, blah, blah, blah. I mean, just how different are these texts anyway? And so, I looked up a passage, John 3:16, and you kind of get a sense of it. So starting with Wycliffe, you see there, for God loved so the world that he gave his one begotten Son, that each man that believeth in him perish not, but have everlasting life. Fair enough. I mean, we get it. But then, version by version, there are differences, right? So loved, so loveth, perish not, should not perish, gave, hath given, but have everlasting life, but should have everlasting life. And then there's sort of like his only Son, his only begotten Son, and stuff like that. So this is kind of the level of wording differences we're talking about. So it's not drastic, but on the other hand, it's highly distinctive. There's enough characteristics there that you can typically pinpoint sort of what text is closest to a different version and stuff. And then for the King James Version, or at least the one I happened to pick up at that moment, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Some other highlights of things about the King James Version in the 1600s. We have the first version in 1611, and just wanted to point out that the first Catholic Bible in English, remember, Douay Ram, from 1610. So, uh-oh, Protestants are coming up with something good. We better just break down and, give the people the Bible in English for the Catholic Church as well. So that the timing of these things, often has sort of motivations and reasons that make sense to us. The Geneva Bible remains in demand. Numerous King James Version editions replace the Bishop's Bible in English churches. In 1679, the Oxford King James Version edition is the first one to introduce the biblical chronology for the dating of the world, like counting back the generations and, the Jesus born at the year 4000 and that kind of stuff. So, that's kind of an interesting aspect of, sort of in an enlightened, increasingly scientific age with enhanced knowledge of astronomy and things like that. There's this drive to more specific understanding about how the Bible fits into the worldview as it is shaping up through the Enlightenment and so on. This is always kind of fun to point out. There's an infamous printing of the King James Version from 1631 known as the Wicked Bible. So, verse 13, thou shalt not kill. Verse 14, thou shalt commit adultery. So, bet someone got in trouble over that. Was it intentional? Was it a disgruntled? Did the typesetter run out of N's and O's and T's? So, he did some more knots down below there. But anyway, so that, this is the kind of stuff that is really, really a big deal to people back then.
I might say it's.
And of course, like for us, it's not a big deal, because with a Word document, you just go and, take out the knot or put it in the but it's a whole different thing. So, looking at some highlights of the King James Version in the 1700s, of course, there's numerous continued reprints, little revisions along the way, modernizing some words, and additionally, it's so popular, it's so extensive that there's kind of cheaper editions, it's a lesser quality text, but affordable. There's just a lot of them around. And then the scholar Campbell calls Benjamin Blaney's work on the King James Version in 1769, the Triumph of Oxford, really a thorough review, revision, which produced a version that was not just another version of King James, but really served as the authoritative, the source for subsequent editions, really from then on, for the most part, until the 21st century. And for example, in the 1600s and into the 1700s, English nouns had tended to become capitalized, just by convention. If you all know German, nouns are capitalized. All nouns. The book, capital B. The man, capital M. Nouns are capitalized. Well, English was going in that direction at the same time period. German did that also in the 17th century especially. I mean, you can just look at printed text and you can see it happening. But English kind of turned back from that. We might easily have been capitalizing all of our nouns too, like German did, but we didn't and we don't. So there you have it. And that may be Blaney as part of the reason for that, because of course the King James Version is probably the most important book around. So whatever the King James Version has is probably going to be a driver of what is definitive. However, this sort of hyper-reverential capitalization of God and Lord and His, like capital H when you're talking about God or Jesus, like hyper-capitalization, that is more a product of the 1800s. And notice that this important work of Blaney, 1769 and that time, coincides closely with important political developments in the British colonies on the east coast of North America. So, I mean, everything about King James is kind of highly pertinent to culture in the colonies as well. So just kind of looking a little bit then at King James, what's going on with it in the 1800s. There is a royal monopoly in England, but really, there's proliferative publishing of Bibles in the US and elsewhere, and the Blaney King James Version is the dominant resource for these versions. And the first Bible printed in America, New Testament in 1777, whole Bible in 1781 in Philadelphia. It's a King James. And it's funny, and I mean, I think that if any of you watch some of the really weird channels on TV that are like way up beyond where all the networks are, and there's kind of these like preachers who have a channel and they're, preaching and stuff like that, and reading from the Bible, and thou art, and stuff like that. It's fair to say that to some degree, in some demographics, that the King James Version, the King James wording itself is approached with a kind of idolatry. That it's sort of this sort of 17th century English is closest to the Word of God, not whatever this is we're talking today. So maybe some people maybe even think that the King James is holier than the Hebrew, Latin, and Greek resources. But on the other hand, as far as this kind of hyper-conservative view of the status of the text, in the 1800s, you also have new forms of publishing and of dissemination, essentially. including, for example, you see on the upper right there was a Harper's Illuminated Bible in 1846. It's colorful and illustrated and Bible. And so so really it becomes in the sort of the Victorian era as part and parcel of that. It's fair to say that the King James Version was viewed as perhaps the supreme work of English prose. And it is. I mean, it is. It's magnificent and amazing and has been profoundly influential. So that's the 1800s. And sort of wrapping up here pretty quick. I wanted to include a little slide like this about thinking of the scope of our topic, the Bible in English. I thought just a quick image of the English-speaking countries. We've been talking, of course, about Europe and about the U.S., but the Bible in English is a worldwide phenomenon. Not only United States and England, but Scotland and Ireland, of course, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, aka the English-speaking world, which you see here. And in fact, this is it's interesting, the terminology. Here we are. This is us. See, it says right there, us. So this. Oh, but wait. This is the U.S. and American Samoa. So if you go to American Samoa, and you say, "Hey, what's up?" They'll understand you. And then this is interesting. American English parentheses Canada.
Oh, boy.
So you go to Canada and like, whoa, the signs and it was like, whoa, what?
British English.
What's going on? Yeah, exactly. Of course. And it all starts in this little bit of the land area of the world, the British Isles. And then there's, of course, British English of Africa, substantial parts of Africa, South Asia, and then, of course, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, although that's complicated because there's also a lot of Spanish and a bunch of native languages that most of us know nothing about in the Philippines. But so that gives you kind of this glimpse of how pervasive and widespread this thing we're talking about really is. But you also notice how much of the world, just perspective. So a little bit then on the 20th century, kind of catching us up to today, essentially. There's essentially Bible proliferation, revisions, new translations, adaptations, inspired especially by, I think it's fair to say, especially by Christian fundamentalism and evangelical Protestantism. There's a whole bunch of this stuff where I really am not prepared to speak in much detail at all, but I think the names are familiar. Revised Version, Standard American Edition, Revised Standard Version, New Revised Standard Version, NRSV. We see that a lot from 1989, striving to be gender neutral, as I understand it. There's the popular annotated Schofield Reference Bible, produced by one Cyril O. Schofield of 1909. And Joel, do you want to say a bit about it? Joel was just giving his evaluation of this text before we got started.
I somewhat jokingly said that's the Bible that ruined America and ruined the world. So the Schofield Study Bible it's a novel theology of the 20th century that started in England by a guy named Darby and came over to America through a movement called the Plymouth Brethren, which is a tiny, tiny sect of conservative Christianity. And they taught this view of Revelation, that the end times is being predicted and laid out, particularly in the book of Revelation, but some other places. And world history is divided up into these different dispensations, these different eras, and we are awaiting the fulfillment of these end time prophecies and eras where things like, oh, I don't know, the nation of Israel is going to be restored, where things like, and so there's all these prophetic understandings, which is a completely novel. People did not read Revelation that way until that time, and I think it's frankly inarguable that that interpretation has overtaken American evangelicalism and has overtaken huge swaths of political movements in our country to very detrimental effects.
Yeah, thanks. This copy belonged to Mona's grandmother. Now, she was really nice and stuff, so. She probably didn't read it, but. So, but yeah, thanks, Joel. Let's see, other Bibles you can mention. High quality scholarly New Cambridge Paragraph Bible, which I've got it. I mean, I read about it, but I don't really know much about it or anything about it. There's also an ecumenical RSV, aka Common Bible, which was created through Catholic Protestant collaboration in 1973. Joel, do you know about that? And again, this is me just reading about Bibles and kind of making notes as I go. Next one, the Message, I think we are familiar. I mean, this church in particular, we've had a lot of engagement with the text of the Message, a Bible paraphrase, and it's good, he calls it paraphrase, not translation, because, you know, it isn't a word for word kind of thing, but yet it tries to stay true to the biblical message by Eugene Peterson and produced essentially from 1993 to 2002. Those aren't the years he lived, because right? I mean, he didn't like do it when he was 10 years old or anything like that. So, but it's fair to say that the Blaney-based King James Version retains a special place in America, and of course a central role in the history of the Bible in English for the world. So, just summing up, a statistic I came up with was that there are over 100 English Bibles dating from the 1380s to today, way too many for 3 hours. I mean, and so we've looked at what, 10 or 15 or something like that. But I mean, there's a whole lot. But through all of that, again, the King James Bible in 1611 really emerged and remains as the crucial point in the history of the Bible in English. It is based on connected and continuous sequence of earlier Bibles in English, like we talked about. And I just kind of, I mean, like a little diagram I noted over there on the right. It's a little moment of review for us of that. It's fair to say that it's the basis for many, perhaps most, later reprints, editions, revisions, adaptations of the Bible in English throughout the 18th century and since then. So, thank you very much. I hope I've enjoyed going through all this history.